Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist. Today I have another Platinum Age Kids Horror review for you all. Now when I say Platinum Age Kids Horror, I'm talking about kids horror that came out before Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps were ever a thing. And if you don't know when they started, that was around 1992. So we're going to be talking about stuff pre that date. Now, often than not, we're going to be looking at anthology shows or anthology material, and sometimes the occasional movie in this series. But for the sake of this series, I'm going to try to keep it, for the most part, in the 1980s, when the kids' horror market was starting to burgeon and become a more prevalent need to be filled when Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps came on the scene in the early 90s. So today, we're going to be looking at an episode from an anthology show that I've actually already talked about in a previous video, which I called Adult Horror Anthology Episodes That Feel Like Kids Horror. If you want to check out that video, there'll be a link in the comment section and in the description of this video. Now, this episode came out in the prolific horror anthology show in the 1980s, Tales from the Darkside. Now, Tales from the Darkside was actually the soft continuation, I should say, but not really, of a movie franchise created by George Romero and Stephen King called Creepshow. Now, Tales from the Darkside originated from the idea of turning Creepshow into a television series. But because of rights issues and because of one studio owning the movie rights and I guess the name and the trademark, George Romero took it upon himself to create a different IP, but essentially recruited all of his friends and people that actually did work on Creepshow's first film to come and join the forces for Tales from the Darkside. And Tales from the Darkside became a hodgepodge of different material throughout the mid-1980s, between 1984 and 1988 specifically. And it kind of helped usher in a new age for especially horror anthology shows, which were kind of on the outs and falling by the wayside in the late 70s from their previous high points in the 50s and 60s, with shows like The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone. By this point, horror anthology was making a comeback, and this show I heavily credit for pretty much the reason why Tales from the Crypt, which was an HBO show outside of this CBS Tales from the Darkside show, actually coming to fruition. It proved a proof of concept that horror anthology still had a place. And horror anthology lasted well through the 1990s as well. So, and it's made a soft comeback from time to time in the past 20 or so years, but it's never been able to stay at the high point of popularity as it was in the 80s and 90s. So we have here an episode from this show that, like I said, was part of the catalyst of all this happening. And this came out in the final season of Tales from the Darkside. This was season 4, episode 14. In specifics, in terms of episode numbers, it was written by Michael McDowell, which, if you don't know who he is, he wrote movies such as Beetlejuice. And I think he was a part of the writing for the sequel, Beetlejuice. I know he wrote a segment for the Tales from the Darkside movie, which was, I guess, the final thing of this franchise for many years until Joe Hill tried to bring it back. But he wrote a segment there as well. But it's actually based on a short story written by a lesser-known writer known as Thomas F. Monteleone. And the episode in question was also directed by Richard Glass, who I recognize directed a few episodes in Tales from the Darkside, and I think Monsters as well, which was the follow-up to this show. And we're going to be looking at a story called The Cuddy Black Sow. Now, The Cuddy Black Sow, when I first watched this episode, I immediately thought that this is definitely prototype Goosebumps to the core. And it sparked interest enough for me to go check out the short story, which I'm not really going to cover in this review, but I'll mention it from time to time. I checked out the short story originally written by Thomas F. Monteleone, and it's collected in an adult horror anthology collection if you're curious about that. And I also checked out its comic book form, which appeared in like an issue of Cemetery Dance back in the early 2000s. And I have to say, I think I prefer the short story in the comic over this version here, because Tales from the Darkside was a low-budget anthology show from the 1980s. They had to cut out some things, I guess, to make it work for television. And because this is involving kid protagonists, they already were walking a very thin line as it is with what they could get away with involving, kid main characters here. And I should say this now. This episode you might have heard of, you might have not, in terms of like reputation with this show. Supposedly, now I don't know if this is 100% true, but when this episode originally aired, I think in 1988, this upset parents and children to the point where I think Paramount stopped re-airing the episode for many years. They hardly, if ever, re-aired it. And most people only got to see it for the first time when it finally appeared on the Sci-Fi Channel and Chiller Network in like the 2000s, maybe early 2010s. So this episode was coveted by Tales from the Darkside fans for many years, and it's become kind of like a fan favorite episode. But to me, I always associate this episode with it being Platinum Age Kids Horror. And of course, I love kids horror. It's one of my favorite subgenres of horror ever. And I love it for historical purposes, and I love it for its own things that it offers here. So off the bat, I highly recommend that you check out the Cuddy Black Sow episode. I think there's going to be some stuff here, especially if you're younger, that probably will scare you. And it will linger with you. You know what I mean? But there are some negatives, and we'll get into that in the review portion that I have with it as well. So don't take it like I'm saying that this is like a perfect thing. I'm not trying to set your expectations so high here with it. Just go in and try to have fun. That's all you can really ask for. So what's this story about? What can we expect out of the Cuddy Black Sow? So the story is about a young boy and his sister who are named Jamie and Gloria. Jamie, I think, is around the age of 8 years old, and Gloria might be 5 or 6. I mean, they're really young characters for a kid's horror story. If not one of the youngest, if not the youngest, you will find in these type of stories. And it's the day before Halloween, or I guess the night before, I should say. And their domicile of living, they're surrounded by their parents as they unlook their sick and dying great-grandmother, who is staying warm by the fireplace, kind of going through delirium about her life and what's coming up on Halloween the following day. And as she's talking, we see Jamie with a tape recorder recording everything she's saying because he thinks that it's useful information, and this perhaps is information that involves his family, and it could come in handy later on, which it inevitably does. And Jamie and Gloria are too young to kind of understand what's really going on, but the parents are like, hey, why don't you two go up to bed? It's getting late, and tomorrow you guys have a big day. You're going to be trick-or-treating, you're going to be eating candy. It's good that you get a good night's sleep, and we'll deal with what we have to deal with tomorrow involving Great Granny. Well, of course, Jamie, being as concerned as he is, he wakes up in the middle of the night and decides to go check out his great-grandmother. But his great-grandmother is still in delirium, and as he's repeating information back to her that he's hearing, she essentially reveals that there's a creature called the Cuddy Black Sow. And he is going to have to be the person in the family to make sure that it stays away. Because if it doesn't, it's going to take somebody's soul. And before he can get more information, he watches his great-grandmother pass away in front of him, which is very dark and heavy. And you might not think that this is totally kids' horror, but from time to time, this stuff does happen. And especially in like stuff like Goosebumps Series 2000, for example. So just know that about it. It does get kind of heavy with it, but not too deep. And Jamie, he's consoled by his father, who overhears the ruckus, and his father confirms that his great-grandmother has in fact died. And the next morning, after Jamie gets a good night's sleep, his parents are telling him that, before they go out trick-or-treating, make sure that their chores are done, whatever they need done is done, whatever. Because they're going to be out trying to deal with arranging the funeral for their great-grandmother and all of that. But Jamie, he hears this and he's like, okay, but he spends majority of the day on Halloween listening to these tape recordings of his grandmother as he's rummaging through her things. And he finds this book, which is a very old book, and it dates back to, I guess, his great-grandmother and her ancestors, who are Scottish immigrants, which the Cuddy Black Sow is based on a Scottish folk legend, right? In case you didn't know that. Well, as he's listening to what his great-grandmother is saying on the audio tape, he's rummaging through the book, and he sees that his great-grandmother's name is there, but there's no death date. There's just a birth date, so he adds that to it. And then he sees the image on the front of the leather-bound book looks to be a creature, so he takes a piece of paper, and he takes a marker over it, and he creates an indentation that this must be the creature that his grandmother is talking about. So as the story goes along, Sister Gloria is getting antsy about going out trick-or-treating, but Jamie is trying to listen to the instructions that his great-grandmother was kind of babbling on her deathbed about, to make sure that everything's in order so they can go out trick-or-treating and they can survive Halloween night. But most importantly to Jamie, he wants to make sure that his great-grandmother's soul will be unaffected by this creature, because it not only can take the living by random happenstance, it can take the dead soul. So there's a certain thing that they have to do involving that. And Jamie realizes that there's these stones that he's going to have to gather, and they're going to have to mark the stones with the letter of the names of the family members. And they have to leave it in a circle within the fireplace while a burning flame is turning the pebbles on fire. And they need to stay in the fire pit, because if any one of the pebbles falls out, whoever's name on the pebble is there, they're susceptible to be targeted by the Cuddy Black Sow. And he knows what this means because he looks through the dictionary early on, and he's trying to figure out what these words mean, so he kind of pieces together the context of what's going to happen. Well, he leaves the stones in the fire, and after he marks all the names of his parents, his sister, and himself, and he also puts his name of his grandmother on one to make sure that her soul is safe. And they head out trick-or-treating. But when they come back, the kids dump out their candy in front of the fireplace, and of course Jamie realizes one of the pebbles have fallen out, and Gloria almost burns herself, and this causes a commotion for Jamie, and he accidentally breaks a lamp nearby because he's shaken up that one of the pebbles did in fact fall out. And he tells his sister to go up to bed because he's in charge and he's older, and she complies, and he decides to look at what name was on the pebble, and he realizes that it was his own name. So he realizes that he's been marked for the Cuddy Black Sow to have that creature come after him. And he spends the rest of the night kind of in paranoia, and he hears these weird noises that makes him, kind of shiver and jump in his skin. And there's like a fake out scene with his sister getting some revenge on a prank that he pulled on her earlier in like an innocent way. But you can tell that Jamie's very shaken up, and it builds up to the end of the story where Jamie thinks that perhaps this Cuddy Black Sow creature is trying to break into his house, but it may or may not be who he wasn't expecting, let's just say. And at the very end of the story, when it's almost past midnight on Halloween to turn into November 1st, there's a interaction with Jamie and who he presumes to be his father that may or may not shake out the way he thinks, and perhaps there's a grisly realization to be had on Jamie's part. And before we get to find out really what's going to happen, there's heavily implied implications that it can't be good. And I'll just leave it there. But that in a nutshell is what you're going to expect out of this story here, the Cuddy Black Sow. So I'm going to say this off the bat. This story, I think, was very riveting, especially for this show, Tales from the Darkside standards. I haven't mentioned this yet, but me personally, and I've covered this show on my Horror Free-for-All channel in detail. I've also talked about my top 10 episodes. If you want to see my channel, Horror Free-for-All, I'll put the link to my channel there in the comment section and in the description of this video for you to go check out. You'll find my Tales from the Darkside thoughts season by season, and I also talked about my top 10 episodes for this show on that channel. When I talked about the Cuddy Black Sow, One thing I think this episode does very well compared to its counterparts is how it displays a heroic character. And you get this from time to time in the show, but more specifically near the back half when they started to utilize more kid protagonists in the stories, which I really enjoyed in season 4 of this show specifically. But seeing a kid as young as Jamie take this tragedy and try to turn it into like a motivation tool for him to save his family and protect his sister and protect his own great grandmother's soul is very mature stuff. And a lot of the times in kids horror, you don't see kids with that level of mature acuity. And I really enjoyed that about Jamie, and I think that he's one of the better kids horror protagonists I've ever seen in material out there. It's unfortunate that he gets a crappy ending, but this is Platinum Age kids horror, so these are some tropes you're going to have to expect, that dark things happen to kids in Platinum Age kids horror. But like I said in my previous video that I brought up earlier, in adult horror anthology episodes that feel like kids horror, this episode and another episode in Tales from the Darkside from season 1, known as Mookie and Pookie, kind of echo this sentiment that kids have some tragedy in their lives, and they have to overcome this tragedy to, I guess, prove something to their family or stop something from affecting their family. So they take it upon themselves and be essentially Kevin McAllister. And I really enjoy that about this story. I mean, you're not going to find many other things in kids horror that resemble what Jamie is doing here. And I really love Jamie. I think Gloria, as a sister character, is pretty much a superfluous clay, as Retro would say. But she's fine, and I guess her actress is cute enough to play up, the adorable little sister role. And for this being set on Halloween, these kids are, kids at heart. They're excited to be celebrating Halloween, but they had this tragedy overshadowing the event, at least for Jamie's point of view, because he's a little more mature than Gloria. Gloria is still stuck on trick-or-treating and all that, but for them two being kind of contrast forces in the episode, Gloria does kind of help alleviate some of the real tension at times when it's needed with what's happening to Jamie. So she's also really, well utilized for what she has to work with. And I will say, the emotions to this story are kind of heart-wrenching. Seeing, a grandparent die at such a young age. You can only imagine, unless you've been through that yourself out there, what that could feel like. And it kind of hits you on the emotional heartstrings. And moving on from that, this being set on Halloween, you're not going to get the greatest Halloween atmosphere, but it's heavily rooted in Halloween lore. It's heavily rooted in some sort of mythology, right? And I like that they're using like a real Scottish folktale to kind of modernize it and essentially try to make a scary stories to tell in the dark meets Goosebumps story out of it. And I think that really weirdly works here. There's some good synergy with this urban legend, or I guess folktale here. And it creates this sense of uneasiness. And you see these shots throughout the episode where we see the Cuddy Black Sow possibly lurking or making noises. And we see its eyes specifically. And the episode does a pretty good job at hiding what it actually looks like till the very end of the story, to create maximum scares, I guess, for children watching out there, because let's be honest, this episode seems to be more made for kids than adults. But it really works, and there's something about it that makes you feel uneasy while watching it. And I would say, I don't say this often, especially with adult horror anthology, let alone kids horror anthology episodes out there. This actually has some scary tension. Go figure. It really does work. I have to tip my hat to them for this. Even down to the lighting and the set lighting, the house where a majority of the story takes place in, it has character to it, and there's a gloom to it, and you don't know why it's so dark and moody. And I guess that adds to the eeriness of the plot as it unfolds in this domicile. And yeah, there's a lot of good things brewing here. And when it comes down to the themes and the messages of the story about, you know, honoring the legacy of your ancestors and protecting what's, you know, current in your lineage, right? Becoming the hero of the story. I've already kind of touched on this, but I think it really does empower the story, and that's where the focus of the story really is, and it really does shine on that. It doesn't ever hardly stray away from that. You know, Jamie is laser focused on putting a stop to this creature from coming, and when he realizes that he's going to have to confront this thing head on, it makes it scary because you know it's going to come. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great things to be had with this story. I mean, a ton. But I will say, in terms of negatives, we do have a few here. The first thing, and I'm going to say this up front, compared to the short story and even the comic version, I can tell you, budget definitely put a damper in what they could pull off here. Now, I will say, I don't think the short story or the comic version ever explored the kids going trick-or-treating in the mid-portion of the episode. But I think, and this leads to my second negative here, I think that when you hit the mid-portion of the episode, you're going to notice that there's a huge time skip in events, and it feels like the episode is missing an entire mid-portion. Whether that mid-portion would be 5 minutes worth of content or even longer, I couldn't tell you. But one thing I think I wish that this episode did was actually show the kids out trick-or-treating, explore the Halloween atmosphere a bit. There's a whole part of the story where we see in the aftermath of it, at least, a pebble has fallen out of the fire. Why not show the pebble falls out of the fire before Jamie and Gloria leave to go trick-or-treating? And we know that while they're out there, they could be susceptible to the Cuddy Black Sow. And we get introduced to the idea that the Cuddy Black Sow is actually in the presence of these kids in that mid-portion and possibly stalking the kids, which makes them scared and come back home. And that's when the realization that Jamie comes to happens with the pebble. And now Jamie is even more petrified. I think that could have added way more scares to it. Now, some people might disagree and say that, hey, you know, they don't mind that because the expert, you know, they did kind of expertly build up tension in that second half, which is fair. But to me, I think this leads to my third negative of the story overall, at least in terms of the Tales from the Darkside version here. The last, 8 minutes of it, give or take, is literally chock full of fake outs. And I'm not just talking one with Gloria, you know, wearing this creepy looking mask, trying to jump scare Jamie. There's a window tap, doors creaking, and there's multiple tacked on one after the other after the other. I wish that we actually had a legitimate climax involving the Cuddy Black Sow, which would have been different from the short story and the comic version, and it would have strayed away from the source material. But this is one of those cases where the episode could have improved the source material by doing that, and it just didn't do it. As a matter of fact, I think the Cuddy Black Sow and the stuff that we are shown in the short story was a bit better done, because it's not just, you know, low budget eyes blinking out of darkness, which is, like I said, effective here, but the things that Jamie sees are way more harrowing in that short story compared here. And like I said, he actually does see some pretty scary phenomenon happening beforehand. So, you know, I think that they had a lot of opportunity here to fix the source material and make it better. But I think for the most part, to encompass all of these negatives in one, it's probably the budget doing all the disservice here, which is very unfortunate because I really do enjoy this episode. As a matter of fact, this was one of the few episodes that I was strongly considering putting on my top 10 of the entire show when I made my ranking, which thanks to everybody on YouTube, that video has to be my most viewed video I've ever put to YouTube on Horror Free For All. It has 20K views, might even have more. I appreciate everybody that went to check that out. I was strongly considering putting that as my number 10, but something prevented me from doing it. And I think I know why after seeing it a few more times since I made that ranking video. It's just missing more action. And if it had that and it had more of a true climax, I think that perfect twist ending that it does have would have hit way better. And I know there is some tweaking you would have to do to have more action and that twist makes sense, the easiest solution would be that you can do it like Jamie was experiencing a dream in the climax of the story where he thinks he's come out on top, but when he is awakened by his father, he realizes that it's still Halloween night, it's still before midnight, and the Cuddy Black Sow can still get his soul before midnight, which is the stipulation in the story, and that if they survive all the way up till midnight, the Cuddy Black Sow can't take their soul, right? And they have to wait till next Halloween before it has another chance to do that, right? But, you know, it would have been kind of cliche to say it was all a dream, but I think it would have made sense in the story to do that. Which, if that was the negative to the whole story overall, if it even was, I'd take that over the negatives I have with this current iteration any day. So, unfortunately, with that being said, what would I rate the Cuddy Black Sow as an episode? I think it's a fantastic Platinum Age Kids horror episode. But the common thing you're going to see in this series is that they do have some flaws. This one, I think majority of it has to do with budget and them trying to cut out a hypothetical mid-portion that they could have fleshed out a bit better, and the poor utilization of the monster. I think that they could have used that better in the hands of Advantage there than they did. And whenever I see potential being wasted like that, it makes the negatives kind of way harder. And like a previous story that I've already covered in this series, The Shadow Man, I was going back and forth between a certain score and what I'm going to give it. This thing, I think, is a very exceptional story, so I think I'm going to lean 4 stars or higher. But where I settled with it is a 4 out of 5 stars. I was leaning possibly giving it a 4.25, and maybe some days I could do that. And in case you don't know, when I'm talking about horror anthology episodes and not just, you know, kids horror stuff, because this is an adult horror show after all. So I'm not using kitty gloves with this, but I'm doing it halfway. I'm meeting halfway with the kitty gloves by doing 0.25 increments instead of 0.5, because these episodes, I guess, are made for kids within a horror anthology show. Like I said, some days I can possibly give it a 4.25, but I'm going to lean a 4 here today just because I think that the potential wasn't hit the best, and it possibly did need a few more minutes to kind of flesh it out, or maybe dialing back some of the fake outs and spending more focus on some areas I wished it did. But nonetheless, you know, this isn't like another episode we already covered, like The Shadow Man, which is featured with 2 other segments within one concentric episode to be sharing the runtime with. No, this is just a standalone story by itself. This kind of shows, very similarly to other shows like Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps, that sometimes, in anthology shows specifically, you need a more malleable runtime to kind of flesh out certain ideas better than the others by having, you know, freedom to do a few more minutes here or there with some episodes, or maybe do it a little bit shorter in some others that don't need the full, I guess, allotted 21, 22 minutes that a lot of shows back then, including this one, fell under that time crunch with. But yeah, I still think this is a very exceptional episode, and a lot of you out there are probably going to really enjoy this one. So go out of your way to go check this episode out. I don't think you'll be disappointed. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Cuddy Black Sow from Tales from the Darkside. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Did you love it? Did you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.